Hello, welcome to this third installment of our discussion of adaptive leadership using the model set forth by Ron Heifetz in the Kansas Leadership Center. I'm Nick Brake with Western Kentucky University. In this session, we're going to talk about the second leadership competency of the KLC competencies, and that is manage self. Remember, part of our discussion of the principles of leadership in our first segment, we talked about the importance of leaders, but we also said that leaders were just one component of the whole process of leadership. The idea that anyone can lead anytime and anywhere. But that means as leaders, anyone that's engaged in the process of leadership has to try to understand themselves and how they fit into the circumstance and the process of leadership. And that can be different depending on your position, depending on the authority and the power you wield, but it also can be different based on the type of problem and the type of challenge. And so trying to understand your part of the mess is really important. And as you get into this, one of the first things that you have to begin to think about is when you are in any kind of process of leadership, as you exercise leadership in managing yourself, you have to understand yourself. You have to understand what your strengths are, what you bring to the table, and what weaknesses and vulnerabilities you have. But Heifetz and the Kansas leadership people like to talk about triggers because it's triggers that oftentimes get leaders in trouble. Things that set leaders off, things that cause them to make lapses in judgment, and things that cause them to make mistakes that are oftentimes preventable mistakes if people were more self-aware. So that self-awareness is a really important component of understanding the reflective nature of leadership. And so understanding what those triggers are, everybody has certain triggers. When I was a superintendent, one of the triggers that I often experienced were people in our secondary schools who would advise students against going to college, advise students against the idea that post-secondary education was for everyone, that they could manage just fine without a college education. And of course, in today's world, compared to the world that they grew up in, college education might mean going to school to be a welder. It might mean a post-secondary training program. It might mean a community college or technical institute. Students today go to colleges for those sort of things. And so any kind of advising those students contrary to that, and contrary, quite frankly, to the data that's out there about success for people after high school that don't seek further post-secondary education, I think is almost a matter of neglective duty. And that was a trigger for me. That was a trigger that I had to be aware of. And when I was in a situation where I heard that, I had to acknowledge, okay, this is a trigger. I had to breathe. Some people like to do different things, like say prayers, or in my case, I just use the very simple adage from the Beatles, all you need is love. Breathe, and then make a conscious choice in how you deal with those situations. Just thinking in terms of this ABC tool can sometimes mean the difference between salvaging yourself in a circumstance and completely changing the dynamic in which you have as a positional person in authority or someone who has credibility as a leader. Viktor Frankl, I like to use his example here, and this is this difference between stimulus and response. You can't choose the stimulus. Certain things are going to trigger you, certain stimuli are going to cause you to go off. But that gap, that ABC gap between stimulus and response, Frankl says, lies our growth and our freedom. And that is important to keep in mind. So one of the first exercises that you can do as you begin the competency of managed self is to identify those things that trigger you and how you deal with them and how you've dealt with them in the past. Take stock of yourself in those kind of situations. Another important component of managing yourself is understanding that leadership involves uncertainty and conflict. And that, as we've talked about in the first components of leadership, the first principles, it's risky. And so part of what you have to do in managing yourself is stay focused on what your purpose is. Those are the things, your purpose, your core, are the things you don't compromise, the things you don't give on. But also make sure that you understand that leadership is a learning proposition and that adaptive change is all about helping people learn through the challenges that impact them. So take opportunities to learn, take opportunities to be reflective and learn from the situations. Also, don't be too focused on right now. Adaptive change is something that is more about progressing, making progress on problems rather than fixing or solving those. Ron Heifetz is very careful to never say that we solved the problem or that we fixed it. His point of view, his nomenclature is always that we are making progress on this challenge. And that's really what adaptive change is about. It's about making progress and continuous improvement and learning. And so valuing productive conflict, I think, is an important piece. And many people that are in roles of leadership, particularly people that come to leadership positions or come to leadership without perhaps positional authority, have a problem with conflict, and they have a problem valuing productive conflict. And so getting used to that takes a little bit of adjusting. And so being comfortable with that is important. Leadership is also a clash of values, and elevating one thing we care about over something else. Sometimes those are values that are really both or multiple values that are all important to us. And so it's important to understand that sometimes you have to choose among these competing values and you have to make decisions. And bear in mind that your values really are the consequence of time, effort, and resources. What you put your time to, what your efforts are about, and your sweat equity is about, and the resources, the financial and other human capital resources. Those are all things that have to be part of the equation when choosing among competing values. Sometimes part of leadership is stepping away from the action to gain perspective and understanding what others are saying and what others are saying about you. Know the story and the narrative about the circumstance and about your role in that circumstance. Heifetz refers to this as getting on the balcony, away from the dance floor. Good leaders have the capability of being on the balcony, but also getting on the dance floor and dancing. And so being able to navigate between the dance floor and the balcony is an important skill. And it's an important element of understanding the story that others say about you. Now, bear in mind that this can be difficult also for people who are novices in leadership, understanding that people are talking about you and what are they saying. It's not so much about changing anything that people are saying. It's not so much about defending yourself. It's just about knowing what's being said. Take that step away from the action to gain perspective, and that perspective is very valuable. The other element that is very important in understanding your role in a leadership circumstance in adaptive change situations is knowing your bandwidth. And I like this video or this visual here that really focuses on the bandwidth that's you at the core, you at the center, your values, your experience, what you've done in your life, the skills that you have, your background, your family, what you prefer, what your triggers are, what your strengths and your vulnerabilities are. And then to the left are all the situations in the world, and to the right are all the people in the world. Most of the situations that will require you to experiment beyond your comfort zone and stretch your bandwidth are situations, are circumstances that are going to involve situations that are new and different and interesting and sometimes challenging and sometimes scary. So being able to experiment and push your bandwidth on situations is important. But for many people, introverts especially, people can be one of the challenging elements of comfort zones. So thinking about all the people in the world that are engaging around you and these challenges that you face, pushing yourself and your bandwidth to experiment with all the people in the world. And so sometimes that creates a challenging situation. I had circumstances when I was a superintendent where people would say things on social media. And part of expanding my bandwidth was being able not to confront those people, but to engage those people in what they said and trying to understand, not to do it in a divisive way, not to do it in a punitive way, but just to listen and understand. And helping them expand their bandwidth about me, but also for me to push my bandwidth. And there were certain circumstances where people were inappropriate or maybe said things that they regret saying. Having the bandwidth to go confront those people sometimes is an effective way to make sure that people don't continue to do that in circumstances where it's not warranted. So it's a fine line, but it's important to understand those situations and those people where you need to push your bandwidth and grow as a leader. And finally, understanding how important it is as a leader to be comfortable with discomfort. You can see again one of the Kansas Leadership Center cartoons, the famous cartoons. In this particular situation, this person felt comfortable with training wheels. But as the trapeze artist is about trying to describe to her, this situation is going to create discomfort for her because those training wheels aren't going to matter. And so being able to expand your comfort zone, to listen to people, to ask questions, to not take things personally, and try to say yes to discomfort and be able to confront discomfort where it's necessary. Leadership is a marathon, not a sprint. It wears you down. Progress doesn't happen overnight. If you are really confronting the adaptive challenges that you need to confront in your organization, your community, whatever it is that where you are leading and where you are engaging in leadership, progress requires continued engagement. And it also requires you to take care of yourself physically, emotionally, and spiritually. The Kansas Leadership Center has some really good materials where you can take stock of yourself and understand what you need, where you are falling down. One of the things I got to doing in my work in leadership as a superintendent is I tried to carve time continually out of my schedule, just 30 minutes, couple days a week to swim for exercise. But I realized that swimming for exercise also became a great way for me to physically, but also emotionally and spiritually, to be underwater, to be away from my device, to be in a position where I could almost pray, and the strokes became almost like a mantra for me. And that became a solace and a comfort that was really important for me to maintain my ability to engage in the marathon, not the sprint. Failing to do that, failing to carve that little bit of time out, that hour and a half a week to do that, would have potentially meant that I was sprinting too much and that I was worn down by the end of my first or second year. So it's important to realize how this component of leadership is really critical. And these are some examples of ways that you can look at your triggers and what value your triggers are connected to. And that's really important, understanding the value of your triggers. This is part of the energy inventory that the Kansas Leadership Center has that I mentioned. One of the questions is, which competency do you find yourself using most often? And of course, we talked about how important diagnose is, and you can see that it's very important as far as the time that's spent in understanding challenges, but manage self actually is one that people find themselves continually going back to understand where you fit into certain circumstances. And so the reality is, if looking at this, and this obviously doesn't add up to 100, it adds up to 200. But if you look at the relative importance of diagnosis, engagement that we're going to get into next, and intervention, managed self is sort of the foundation. You have to let this undergird everything you do. And it's an important component of leadership. So the next time we're going to get into engaging and energizing others as you look at the kind of adaptive work required in exercising leadership.